everyone. Thanks for coming today. I am Margaret Mantor, and I work for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Habitat Conservation Planning Branch. I just wanted to share with you guys a couple slides before we get started today. So welcome to the Conservation Lecture Series. This is the most up-to-date schedule that we have of upcoming lectures. So we've got quite a few scheduled for April. We're going to be having Sierra Nevada Redfox, Alameda Striped Racer. That was one that was canceled. It's been rescheduled, so that'll be on April 24th. We're going to have California Tiger Salamander again, Shasta Crayfish, and then in May we'll have Desert Tortoise, and in June, Amargosa Bull. And just notice that the Shasta Crayfish and Desert Tortoise, those are going to be in regional offices, so for those of you that are here in person, you are welcome to watch those ones on WebEx. So if you have any questions about any of the lecture series, feel free to give me an email and let me know if you have any questions or if you need any information. Today, we're really happy to have Dr. Joeseph DiTomaso, who's going to be giving a lecture on yellow star thistle. And so far, this lecture series has really been concentrating on listed species or species that we are concerned about for conservation. Yellow star thistle and other invasive weeds, though, we felt are really a good thing to have in this lecture as well because they're also a concern for people that are managing for listed species. And it was something that came up as a result of our CTS lecture, people wondering about, well, how do we manage yellow star thistle on lands for CTS? Dr. DiTomaso received his PhD from UC Davis in 1986, and he spent nearly 8 years on the faculty at Cornell University before he returned to UC Davis. He's been at UC Davis in the Department of Plant Sciences since 1995. His research focuses on understanding biological and ecological aspects of non-crop weeds, and particularly invasive species of wildlands and rangelands, and uses the information to develop effective control strategies for those species. Dr. DiTomaso has published over 150 peer-reviewed manuscripts or books, and a total of over 250 papers. He's also co-author on 4 books. He's the first editor for the new journal Invasive Plant Science and Management, and he's also the director for Weed Research, for the Weed Research and Information Center. He serves on both the National and California Invasive Species Advisory Committee, and he's the president of the Weed Science Society of America. So we're really pleased to have him here today. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, everybody. So today I'm going to talk a lot about the biology and the ecology of yellow star thistle and relate that to all the different kinds of strategies that you can use to manage the plant. But since you guys are usually talking about animals and mostly endangered species, do many of you like to eat yellow star thistle honey? Have you ever had that? It's actually considered prized honey. You should read the label that's on the back of that because it'll tell you that yellow star thistle is an endangered species. I don't know where they're collecting their honey, but it's not endangered here. Maybe in the desert it's an endangered species. Okay, so let's just put it in perspective. This is the most invasive species, and when I talk about invasives, I'm talking about natural areas and wildlands, which is the area that I typically work in. These are the most invasive species in the United States. You can see downy brome, which many people call cheatgrass, dominates, and it's by far the most invasive species, and it's transformed so many landscapes in the western United States in particular, mainly because it changes the fire regimes. But number 2 on that list is yellow star thistle, and it's twice that in terms of area over number 3, which is Canada thistle. So clearly it's a major invasive species in the western United States. And this is its distribution in the western U.S., and I'll just give you a little history of how it got here and how it really spread. It's thought that star thistle, if you look at the seeds of star thistle, and I'll show you pictures of the seeds, they're very much the same size and shape as alfalfa seed. And so star thistle, even in its native range, was historically a minor problem in alfalfa. And alfalfa was grown for horse feed. And so when the Spanish came to South America, they brought their horses with them. And they didn't know what to expect when they got to South America, so they brought their alfalfa seed with them, thinking that they might have to grow alfalfa to feed their animals. Well, of course, star thistle was a seed contaminant within the alfalfa seed. And so they settled in South America, particularly in the Mediterranean climates, which would be Chile in South America. And then during the gold rush in California, a lot of the Spanish got on their ships and moved up into California to take advantage of the gold, brought their horses with them, brought their alfalfa seed with them, and we ended up with yellow star thistle here. The first collection was about right around 1849, and it was in Oakland. And then the first real problematic region of yellow star thistle was in Marysville, Yuba City, Marysville area, where they were growing hay, and this was back in the turn of the century, so it was over 100 years ago. And in that area, they were growing hay, mostly for local consumption, and, of course, star thistle really exploded in that particular area and became a major weed problem. But it really stayed there for many years, 40, 50 years, never really moved much out of the Marysville area. And then something very revolutionary happened in the United States, and that was the invention of the tractor. So you might think, tractor, what does that have to do with yellow star thistle? Well, when the tractor was invented, people could use way more land to grow alfalfa. And in fact, they could grow far more alfalfa than they could grow for themselves. So they started to sell their alfalfa. Well, corresponding to that, then they had to build an infrastructure so they could move hay around. So they built the road systems within the state. And so all of a sudden, these people were putting things on trucks and vehicles, moving them from region to region, and at that point, star thistle began to explode into California because it was the seed as a contaminant of alfalfa started to get moved around the state. There's one other thing that I find very interesting about star thistle and how it spread. Star thistle is pollinated by native bumblebees, and none of those native bumblebees are really here in California. So when star thistle first came here, it wasn't very fecund. It didn't produce a lot of viable seed. It had no nectar. So I told you right from the beginning how great the honey is. Well, how do you make honey with a plant that has no nectar? It evolved nectar as a response to honeybees. So it was selected for, just through a very rapid evolutionary process. Honeybees would pollinate the plants that produced a tiny bit of nectar. Those plants would then develop seed, and their progeny would develop nectar, and honeybees would, again, pollinate the ones that produced the most amount of nectar. And over several generations, star thistle began to produce nectar. So it was very non-fecund, did not produce a lot of viable seed until the point where it produced so much nectar that honeybees pollinated almost every flower, and it started producing about 75 seed per seed head. And I think that the high seed production, along with the transportation, is what accounted for its rapid spread. Now, you can see from the map here that it started right here, in the Bay Area, and it expanded up, and now it's, as I say, it's leaking out of the state, moving farther north, certainly into Oregon, but also into Idaho, where it's a big problem, and Washington and a few other states. So as I said, showed you in the last slide, it probably occupies close to 15 million acres, and probably somewhere in the area of 12 million of those acres are in California. So, hey, we're number one. And this is a CDFA map developed many years ago that shows sort of the distribution of star thistle by township within California. The red is the densest locations where star thistle is located, and then I guess I would kind of call that orangey, is the least dense, and then the other, I guess the kind of light green color, is where star thistle does not do well. And you can see if you look at the areas where it does not do well, maybe there's a little corner up in Del Norte County where it doesn't do so well because it's just too much water there. The other areas it doesn't do so well are in the high mountain regions of the Sierra Nevada and also in the dry deserts. There's several species of Centaurea. This is, of course, Centaurea solstitialis. and there's several of them. They almost all come from Europe. That's the center of origin of Centaurea. In fact, if you look at Flora Europa, there's over 200 species of Centaurea that are native to that region. So there's another yellow species that looks a lot like star thistle, which some people call tocolote, other people call Malta star thistle, and others call it Napa star thistle, but it's Centaurea melitensis. And that is a species that flowers much earlier in the year, not as late as yellow star thistle is, and so it's better adapted to the drier regions of the state. So if you're in San Diego and Los Angeles and those kind of areas and you have what you think is yellow star thistle, it typically is melitensis and not yellow star thistle. Most of the yellow star thistle is in the Central Valley and the foothill regions of California. So because you can see star thistle is such a major problem, several years ago we went through the literature, 267 articles at that time on star thistle, and we wrote a yellow star thistle management guide, which I don't have any more copies except for this one, but it's free on the CALIPSI, California Invasive Plant Council's website, and you just go into publications, look at the star thistle management guide, and it's broken down by each chapter on the biology, ecology, and management. So most of the things I'm going to tell you today are in this, except for the newer things that we've been working on that post-date this publication that we did. Okay, so let's get into a little bit about the biology of the plant. Now you can see from the top left-hand photo that star thistle seeds look very much like an alfalfa seed, if you know what an alfalfa seed looks like. And they have two different types of seed. They have the seed that has this pappus. The pappus is the structure, say, on a dandelion that would allow it to wind disperse, and many other plants that wind disperse. It's a member of the Asteraceae, the sunflower family. But it has about 75% of its seed are pappus-bearing, and 25% of its seed are non-pappus-bearing. That's the darker seed that's lying down right next to it. Now, typically, a pappus is there for wind dispersal, but in the case of star thistle, it's not there for wind dispersal. It's there to get the seed out of the seed head. Star thistle tends to lose its spiny bracts later on in the year. So early in the year, those little sharp pappus that surround the seed, they open up and they sort of push their way. They allow the seed to push its way out to the top, and then when the flower, the seed head shakes, it blows off. It really doesn't blow more than 2 feet. A lot of people think that star thistle blows in the wind long distances. It really doesn't. 92% of the seed fall within 2 feet of the parent plant, and almost all of them are within, even in a heavy wind, don't go further than 30 feet. So it doesn't really move long distance by wind. Those bracts fall off later on in the year, and when they fall off, then those seed that don't have a pappus, which are on the outer layer, then they fall out. So it gives star thistle sort of 2 opportunities to disperse its seed into the ground. Now, melitensis, as I told you, the one that looks like star thistle, we have it up here too. It's just not as common. It only has the pappus-bearing seed. It does not have the one that has no pappus. And the reason is because those spiny bracts never fall off of the plant. So it does no good to have a line of seed on the inside, because they're never going to have an opportunity to fall out if the spiny bracts never fall off. So it only has one. So star thistle moves by seed here and there. It's an annual, it's a winter annual, so it's only going to survive, typically only survive one season, and that means it's linked between one generation and the next is its seed. So then it develops with the first rainfalls, and I'll show you some data of this. It develops a little rosette, and the rosette stays as a rosette for quite a few months. So let's say this is not a real good year to use as an example, but with the first rainfalls might occur in October, November in California. And so the most of the seed is going to germinate in that first rainfall, and it's going to sit as a rosette, and you can see the small little rosette, little seedling in the top here, and then in the bottom is a bigger rosette. It's going to stay like that from October till about April. So it's still in that, most of it is still in that form right now. And you might be thinking, well, why does it just sit there? Well, as it's sitting there, what it's really doing is putting down a very deep root system. So all the growth, there's foliar growth, but most of the growth in the plant is occurring below ground to put down a very deep root system. And I show you on the right here, at day 24, if you can see that meter stick, the root is only a few inches long, and by day 60, which is just a little over a month, that root is over 6 feet deep. So that's what it's doing early on. It's doing everything, most of its work underground, and I'll explain why. So we actually monitored germination over time because it's important to management, and I'll bring this up later on too. So on the top panel here, this is the germination, and in dates, and this is over a couple of years. We planted 1,000 seed, and then every week or two we went out, counted the seed, and then pulled them out so we could account for them all in 2 years. And you'll notice on the bottom here is the rainfall totals. Sure wish we had a year that looked like that this year, but we haven't. But in this year, you can see that the highest germination occurred at the beginning of the year, but what's really important here is that there is germination at every rain event. And that's important to management, because sometimes people come in early on in the year, February, and they say, well, if we just take care of these with some tillage or with some other kind of control that doesn't have residual activity, we can get rid of star thistle, and they actually fail almost every time they do that. And the reason is because there's a whole new batch that germinates at the next rainfall. So they'll germinate with every rainfall event. And you can see, of course, during the summertime here, there's no rainfall, and then at the next season starts, this is the same batch of 1,000, so there's not 1,000 anymore in here. You get a first rainfall event, you get another flush of germination, and you do with almost every rainfall event. So they'll germinate as long as there's rain. You'll get a batch of germination, except in the summer with a thunderstorm. I thought I had a really clever way of controlling star thistle. I thought, if you could just irrigate a field, you can make in the middle of summer, in August, you can make all these seedlings, these seeds germinate, and then it'll dry out and they'll all die, and I can get rid of my star thistle population in a single year by just letting them germinate themselves to death. It didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is we thought it would work because we collect seed off of the plant and we bring it into the lab and we get 100% of the seed germinating. So I thought, well, they'll germinate then. Just give them water. But what happens is the seed hit the soil. The soil during the summer is very hot. It triggers the seed to go into what is called secondary dormancy. And now the plant won't germinate until it gets water and cold temperatures, not just water. I mean, it's like, well, of course, this plant isn't that stupid. It just doesn't germinate with a thunderstorm. It has to have the conditions that'll keep it alive. So got outsmarted. So this is some of our data just to show you. On the top panel is how fast the rosette is growing, and on the bottom panel is how fast the root is growing. So the root is growing downward as it moves downward, and the rosette is getting bigger as you see that line go up. And so you can see that as the rosette begins to expand, it's photosynthesizing more, putting more sugars down into the root system, and stimulating that root to grow very deep. And it doesn't take very long to do that. So that's the way it grows. And I'm going to tell you more about that because I'm going to tell you how that makes it very competitive. So once it begins to bolt, and that typically occurs in April and where we are right now, at least the bulk of the population will bolt in April. It changes quite a bit, and people sometimes don't recognize the plant when it's bolted from when it's a rosette. When it's a rosette, it's very green, and it's got lobed leaves. And then it bolts, and it's very silvery or gray. We call it glaucous. That's the term that's used to describe it, kind of a bluish cast to it or grayish cast to it. Mainly that color, that grayish bluish cast, is due to very high wax production, and also it has hairs too. The other thing is, you can see on the right-hand side, if you look at the stem, the stem has baffles, or you can call them wings, but I like to think of them as baffles. And so what the plant is doing when it bolts is it's preparing for a really hot, dry summer, because this is a very long-lived annual plant. I mean, it's still around in September and August when it's very hot and dry in California. And so the gray or the bluish coat to it allows the plant to reflect a lot of light. It's like touching, if you touch a car that's light in color versus a car that's dark in color. The dark car is during the middle of summer, the dark car is going to be a lot hotter. So it gives it the ability to reflect a lot of the light and not absorbed as heat. But the light that is absorbed as heat then can dissipate out through the baffles like a radiator. So it's like its own little radiator. If it builds up too much heat, those wings allow it to dissipate out the heat that it builds up. So it's just built for a Mediterranean climate, hot, dry summers. And that occurs from May, and then it'll put in its flowers down. Flowers it'll usually flower around the end of June. Now, its scientific name is Centaurea solstitialis. Centaurea it's named after a spearman in the Roman Empire, a centurion, who is the warrior that carries a spear. And of course, if you know yellow star thistle, you know it's got plenty of those spears sticking out of its spiny head. So that's how it got its genus name. Its epithet name you could probably figure out. It's the time of flower, solstitialis. It flowers at the summer solstice, which is around June 21st. So right in that time is when it begins to flower, and that's how it got its scientific name. Now, I told you it puts this really deep root system down, and it tends to put this root system down, and I'll show you more about that, but as a primary root, a very deep, long, skinny root. And then when it gets all the way to the bottom, it starts putting out all these lateral roots to capture and grab all of the water. So if you compare the water use pattern between yellow star thistle and, say, an annual grass, that's up here is AG, that's annual grass, and of course YSD is yellow star thistle. And then the WG is a perennial grass called a wheatgrass. That's what it stands for, wheatgrass. That's a perennial grass. You can see that the higher the level in here, the more soil moisture there is. An annual grass starts out higher, it recharges more because it uses less water. So in the summertime, the annual grass will dip down. Let's see if I can show you with the mouse here. See that? It dips down, and then when it begins to rain again, it comes up to a higher level. The next year it dips down again in the summertime, comes up in the wintertime. This was a year we had almost no rainfall right in here, and so we didn't recharge any of the soil moisture. We compare that to the diamonds, which is the wheatgrass, and it uses more moisture than annual grasses, as you might expect. A perennial grass is going to be a deeper root system and use more because it's going to use water longer in the year too. And it dips down again. And then you can see the round circles, the solid circles, that's yellow star thistle. And you see how much water it uses? Way more water than annual grasses and even more water than a perennial grass. So it's a real water user in the whole profile. To compare all the years together on it, you can see the annual grass again is the open circle, and it uses about 9.9 centimeters of water. So when it rains, 9.9 centimeters, 10 centimeters, about 4 inches of water. 4 inches of water is what that annual grass is using. The wheatgrass is using 6 inches of water, and yellow star thistle is using even more than that, maybe 7.5 inches of water. So it's using way more water than either one of those two species. What's the significance of that? Well, in a dry profile, it's using about 6.6 centimeters more water than annual grasses. And if you do any kind of economics of water use, and I'm not really sure what the water use is now, but if you adjust it to, or water costs are now, but if you adjust it to a hectare, and then say it's an acre, it uses about a fifth of an acre foot of water, yellow star thistle, more than grasses do. So that would amount to about $2.50 to $6.50 an acre that you're losing, which is a lot for a rancher. That's a lot of money. Now, that's just our estimate. John Gerlach's done this, too, in his dissertation. He calculates twice as much as us in terms of yellow star thistle water use. But he's still in the ballpark of us. So it's using quite a bit of water. And how does that translate into gallons of water? Well, in Siskiyou County alone, that's the equivalent of about 26 million gallons of water. Star thistle is using more than grasses would use. What that means on an ecological perspective is that, as I say here, the equivalent of 15 to 25% of the mean annual precipitation. What that means is you have to have 15 to 25% more rainfall that year for the plants within that field or area you're working in to think it's normal rainfall. In other words, you always have to have a really, really rainy year for it to be essentially normal to the native plants within the area or the other plants within the area that you may desire. If you get a normal rainfall year, it's a drought. Even normal years is a drought. So star thistle creates its own drought for other plants. So we had an El Nino year back in 1998, and I took this picture in Calaveras County, and star thistle did phenomenally well. When I took this picture, there was something I noticed in this scenery, as pretty as it might appear if you don't know that's all star thistle, something that's missing. See something that might be missing from this photo? How about young oaks? So star thistle puts such a deep root system down and sucks up so much water that what does it compete with? Not really with annual grasses, because annual grasses use surface water and it's using deeper water. It's competing with oak saplings, oaks that are trying to get established, and you don't see hardly any young oaks, only old oaks in this photo. So this is where it can have a significant ecological impact throughout California. So we're trying to get more at this water idea and trying to figure out the life cycle as it might relate for us to develop management strategies. So probably I could be arrested for this, I'm not sure, but a graduate student, actually, he developed this experiment. He put phone booths in the ground, and he had a glass wall on them, and then he climbed in and worked in those throughout the summer. And we had all these different plots in here. So, I mean, you can imagine, him working. Of course, I didn't put the top on him when I was in there, but he would climb down in these kinds of things, and he'd look at this big glass wall, and he would monitor every couple of days root growth. Now, all the roots he's looking at are going to be lateral roots because the primary root grows straight down. So the roots he's going to see are all lateral roots. And he monitored even into, this really hot, dry part of the year. And he monitored three things. He monitored with probes in the ground. He monitored CO2 release. He monitored water in the moisture levels in the soil, and he monitored root growth. And I'll tell you how you can use this information. So he's marking these things and measuring them, and he's doing this all the time. His name is Steve Young. This is his dissertation, or part of his dissertation. And at the same time, monitoring all those other things that I mentioned. This is for the neutron probe. So you can stick a probe down in there, and you can estimate how much soil moisture there is at any depth within the soil that the probe goes down to. So just to show you a comparison, the top panel here is yellow star thistle, and as you go down this, it's depth. Okay, so yellow star thistle is shallow right in here. That's 1 foot deep, and that's down to 6 feet deep. This right here is Elamus glaucus. It's a native perennial grass, which we try to use in some of our restoration programs. And the one on the bottom is gumweed, a Grindelia camporum, which is also a native broadleaf species, perennial. And so what you can see here, if you look at this one, is that the yellow star thistle shows pretty much an even distribution of roots all the way through the profile. And the bottom axis here is time. So it shows an even distribution through the profile. The Elamus glaucus, which is blue wild rye, shows mostly its roots in the upper surface, with some roots going very deep. And the Grindelia I didn't really do, and I'll talk about Grindelia later. I'm just going to compare the first two. Did this the second year. It wasn't enough to do it 1 year. You had to do it twice. And in the second year was very much a drought year. So we didn't have nearly the rainfall, and so star thistle produced only 72% fewer roots than it did the year before. So not nearly as many roots because there wasn't as much moisture. And you'll notice that most of the roots are in the upper profile. So star thistle is adapting to where the moisture is. The moisture's in the upper profile. That's where it grows most of its roots. Elamus, on the contrary, had 50% fewer roots, but they were very deep because they really couldn't access later on in the year any surface moisture. So they were using most of the deep moisture. Okay? So that's what I say right in here. So now we put it all together. Here's the CO2 level. The CO2 level is in this case, the blue. As it's going up, that means roots are developing because CO2 is released through respiration. And so as a plant is burning carbohydrates, it's releasing CO2. So that means it's growing. It's respiring to create new roots is what it's doing. And then as it drops off, it's not creating as many roots. So if you kind of look at that, here is the stage of development when the roots are growing, and the red line is the root growth. That's how many live roots there were. Which is kind of surprising. It says that most of the roots in yellow star thistle are growing from about right now, okay, right towards the end of March. Lateral roots now, a lot of roots, and pretty much stops towards the end of May. Roots. We had always thought earlier that star thistle just keeps producing roots to utilize all the soil moisture late in the season, but it stops towards the end of May. Okay, so that's the root growth pattern. This is the water use pattern, and again, the live roots are in red, and the water use is in blue. So you can see that water isn't really used very much in the soil up until about beginning of May, mainly because there's constant rain in a normal season replenishing that water, and then the rain kind of stops and now the roots start using water. So here is the water use for yellow star thistle. You notice that they don't really use much more water after about the end of June. So this is totally different than what we thought. We thought star thistle was using water in August and September when it's still growing out there. But it's not using any water at that time of the year. It's using water in this narrow window of time that goes from about the beginning of May to about the beginning of July. So May and June. It's like a 2-month period in which it's using as much water as it possibly can. Okay, so to put it in perspective then, here's the root construction zone. It goes from March to about the end of May. The water use time goes from about the beginning of May to about the beginning of July, and then reproduction occurs after that. So there's no real more root growth and there's no real water usage when star thistle starts to flower. So that means, if I think about this, I'm going, you can't save any water by controlling star thistle late in its growth period. It's already used all the water it's going to use. So it's going to be already have caused damage to the plants that you want to do well if you treat that late in the year. So that kind of summarizes that. The establishment stage, where it's a rosette, occurs to about the end of April, and then you get, at that point, you get it bolting, and that only takes about a month, and then you get it developing the spines, and that usually happens in about May and June, and then the end of June, you start to get reproduction that goes on until typically end of September, maybe into October. If you look below ground, the taproot is elongating just straight down for the bulk of that time until March, and then the lateral roots all developed in March, and then it starts, when the lateral roots are developing, it's using all the water. All the water's already gone, and now it starts to go into the root senescence, and it starts to go into flowering stage. Okay? So, just to conclude on that, on the root dynamics, because the root dynamics, understand the root dynamics of star thistle is extremely important to doing any kind of restoration of the plant, of an area. So, the years where there's no real deep soil moisture recharge, then star thistle is going to utilize shallow moisture, just like the grasses do. So, this is why star thistle does so poorly in a grassland when it does not recharge its deep soil moisture. We've had years we go out there and we don't hardly see any star thistle. And the reason is it cannot compete for shallow moisture with annual grasses. They are just way too competitive. They produce fibrous root systems and a lot of plants. So it can't compete, and it does not do well under a drought year competing with annual grasses. In a normal year, though, where you get deep soil moisture, then it's going to do very, very well because the grasses don't utilize that deep soil moisture, and it's all there available for star thistle. Grindelia camporum, the gumweed, just does not have the ability to compete with star thistle late in the year or to compete with most anything. So we put it in a lot of our restoration programs because we like it out there. It gives us diversity. It's a native plant. It's pretty. And it usually stays in there for a couple of years and disappears. So it really likes this continuous little disturbance so it can get itself established. Okay. So the significance is that the control of star thistle is really going to be most efficient right before it starts using water. because you can control star thistle, and all of that water is there then for any of the species you want to have, your desirable species. Those could be natives, or they could be whatever your ecosystem services that you're looking to do. So there's no impact on water use if you get rid of it before the bolting stage. Right now, for example, would be a good time. Or last month would even be a better time. And then the biomass and the reproductive output of plants has already been determined by the time star thistle goes into flowering. So it already kind of knows when it starts to flower how big it's going to be and how much seed is going to be putting out, because it's determined by how much moisture it already has in the root system. So it's kind of very different than what we thought when we first started working with yellow star thistle. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about a plant and relate it back to star thistle. Have many of you heard of this plant called stinkwort or Ditrichia? It's gotten a lot of press lately. It's pretty much a new plant that has come into California. It's in the same family. It's a very, very late season annual, just like star thistle is. It was first identified in California in Santa Clara in 1984, and then it started expanding about 1995, and these are the number of counties this moved into. And it has expanded so rapidly. I've never seen a plant move this fast through the state of California from its first introduction time. There's almost no lag period. If you call that a lag period, that's only a couple-year lag. That's a 10-year lag period. Star thistle had pretty much a 70-year lag period before it really started expanding. This one had very little lag period at all. So people have been really concerned with this particular plant as a late season. This kind of tells you how rapidly it's spread around the state. The blue is the most recent movement, and the brown to the yellow is where it was first found, and then the red. So it's moving very quickly, and obviously it's moved into Southern California right in here, so it's probably not wind dispersed. This seed is wind dispersed, though, truly wind dispersed. This was probably moved by vehicles and people. So we conduct an experiment to compare this plant against yellow star thistle, and also against the native tarweed called Holocarpa virgata, virgate tarweed. And the idea is this plant going to be the next yellow star thistle in the state of California? Is it going to take over our rangelands like star thistle does? So we looked at its moisture use and its root growth, just like we did in the other experiment. But just to compare it, we'll ignore the middle one in here, just look at the top and the bottom one. Here's star thistle that I kind of explained to you at the top here. Germinates, forms a rosette to this tame, then it's got moderate growth, exponential growth, and then it flowers and fruits. The bottom one is yellow star thistle. But if you compare that against Ditrichia, you see Ditrichia is a much later plant than star thistle. It doesn't even begin to flower until the end of August. Star thistle's already been up for two months flowering before that. So this is really a late season winter annual. This one doesn't even begin to flower. We figure that most of the flowers come out about September. And the plant doesn't even senesce till December when it dies from frost. So it's very late season. We were very concerned about it, so we wanted to compare the root growth. And so I just want to show you. Here's star thistle compared and Holocarpa. Holocarpa is a native perennial. So Holocarpa and star thistle start to expand their canopy and grow and really exponentially grow above ground about May. So I told you they'll bolt in April, and then they really expand in May. Both Holocarpa and star thistle do that. Star thistle is the one I'm pointing to here, the open circle, and Holocarpa is the open diamond. So those do the same things. And you can see that Ditrichia, which is the solid diamond, is way, way behind. Still very low. It's down in here at this time. So it's very slow in developing its above ground growth. When you look at its root growth and how deep its roots go, you can see that around March, like I showed you before, star thistle starts to really go down and put its root deep. As does Holocarpa. They do the same thing. So this native plant is very similar to yellow star thistle. That tells me that Holocarpa, if you want it out there, and if you're looking for diversity and it's not a rangeland, it would be a great competitor with star thistle because it can use the same, it's functionally a similar plant. But I want to point out here that look at Ditrichia. It doesn't even begin to produce a deep root until about May. And it's much like what I was telling you about star thistle when there's not enough water. So May is when all of our grasses die. And its roots are right there with our grasses, our annual grasses. So this plant cannot compete in a grassland. It just can't compete with annual grasses. It will dry out. And you very rarely see it in a rangeland area. You see it all along roadsides. It's moving everywhere in disturbed areas, but it rarely gets into a rangeland environment. So this data tells me this plant is not going to be another yellow star thistle. Yellow star thistle is very unique, but it has native plants that do the same thing. And the native plant is holocarpa and other tarweeds. Now, ranchers hate these plants, even though they're native. But if you're managing for a wildlife area, these are desirable things. Okay. So that's kind of the biology of star thistle. I hope you kind of understand now how the plant works and functions in our ecosystem. And I'm going to refer back to that as I talk about management strategies, because the management strategies, whether they work or don't work, are going to directly relate to what I just told you on the biology. So does anybody have any questions before I go on any aspect of star thistle? Does anybody have any questions online, the webinar? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So the water use, you were showing that uses most water around May, I think, for star thistle. Does that depend on time of germination? Because on your charts it was showing a lot of germination in October, November, not in February or March.
Doesn't really.
Okay.
And the reason is because the plant bolts by photoperiod. So a plant that is germinating later on in the year, if it doesn't have that moisture, if it's not an irrigated pasture, if that's an irrigated pasture, then it's going to put a deep root system down. But if it doesn't get irrigated, those plants never produce, those late blooming plants or late germinating plants never produce but one little flower head, because they don't get deep enough and don't get enough energy, and they've used all the moisture, so they produce one head. Now, we were in Siskiyou County one time, and we had a huge population of star thistle. So we started counting how many plants there were per unit area, and we found there were 1,000 plants per square foot. It's a lot to count for just a square. We were going to do by square meter, and we went, 10,000 plants is too many to count. Let's do it by square foot. Every one of those plants is this big, except once in a while you get a very large plant. And we were saying, wow, the large plant must be the early germinating plant. So it germinated early, got its root down, and all the rest of these are late germinating plants. And so we thought, well, what's the function of having so many seed out there, which most of them are going to, and those plants, by the way, they dry out in May, and they try to produce a seed. Most of them don't even get it up. They dry out. They don't even open the flowers. So we said, well, what's the function of that, when only one can survive? And then we thought, well, the function is that it's eliminating all competition. You got 1,000 plants using soil moisture right at the surface. How can anything else compete with it? And then you got the one plant going deep and using deep soil moisture. It doesn't have to worry about all of that. So it is essentially eliminating all of its competition by creating worker bees, in a sense. All of these plants that act like worker bees, just sucking up the shallow soil moisture. So there's probably a function for the plant germinating later in the year. Now, that doesn't happen with all plants. Some plants will germinate within a two-week window. Everything germinates, and if it doesn't germinate based on photoperiod within a 2-week window or temperature, it won't germinate after that. But in the case of star thistle, it'll germinate year-round. So that's what I think is the function of it, of why it would do that. And that's why, star thistle could produce 100 million seed an acre. Does it really need 100 million seed an acre in our area? No. It doesn't need 100 million. If you can knock out 95% of seed production, you probably wouldn't see the difference in the final population the next year. So what's the advantage to producing that many seed? Maybe they eliminate other competition. Good question, though. Anything else online? Okay. So shall I move into? You guys okay? You want a break? You all right? You want me to move into control? Okay. So let's start out, we'll talk about mechanical, biological, cultural, chemical, and then I'll talk about integrated approaches and why I think integrated approaches are the best way to go. So mechanical, not something you guys would do very often, but you can use various types of tillage equipment. Well, before I go on, let me go back. Hand pulling, hoeing, weed whips are all used for start thistle. Any of these types of controls have to be before viable seed are produced, or you're not doing really a whole lot of good. People ask me this all the time. If I pull out a yellow start thistle plant, can I just throw it on the ground, or do I have to bag it and carry it out? And I would tell them that if you waited until the plant had already produced a lot of flowers, you can't leave them there. You're probably wasting your time anyway, and second of all, it hurts a lot more. So if you do it before they produce flowers, then you can just throw them on the ground and they'll dry out and die. So you can do all of these different things, but usually they're done in fairly small areas. Tillage might be done in a larger area, but we rarely do this in natural areas or wildland areas. It's too disruptive to the native vegetation and the other things we might like. And in your case, it's not probably very good for the endangered species out there either. So these are not strategies I see that often. I occasionally see them in a pasture area, those kinds of areas, or in vineyards where they would have star thistle or that kind of an area. And they work fairly well, but the timing has to be just right. What you're trying to do when you do tillage is you're trying to detach the root from the shoot. And of course, I told you, star thistle roots get very deep. You can when you detach that deep root from the shoot, you kill that plant. Because that root is what it needs to get its water up to grow. So you can use tillage, but I've seen areas, and I used to have a picture in here, it wasn't a very good picture, so I don't use it anymore, of an area in which they tilled probably in March. And it was over in the Napa area, and it was a hillside. And they tilled it all in March, and by July, there was nothing in that field but star thistle. It was the only plant in that field. They eliminated all their annual grasses by the tillage, because they killed them too. It was dry when they did it, so they thought this is good timing to kill my yellow star thistle. They had a very wet March and April after that. All the star thistle germinated, put down a very fast, deep root system. It was warm outside, so it grew very fast. Put down a deep root system. None of the annual grasses came back up. The whole field became yellow star thistle. So timing of even something like tillage is very important. What's the best time if you're going to till? Probably at the end of the rainy season, and when the plants are not going to germinate anymore. There's no more rain, and they can't really develop their full potential. So that's right before it produces seed. That's typically in May and June. Most people don't do that. So tillage is not a normal way of controlling star thistle in California. Is mowing a way of controlling star thistle in California? Well, actually, mowing is a way of expanding star thistle in California, and Caltrans does this. This is a typical highway in California, and especially northern California. In southern California, it's mostly Russian thistle or tumbleweed. Northern California, it's typically star thistle. And why is there so much star thistle on the roadsides in California? Star thistle cannot handle shade. It has to have full sunlight. So you get more moisture on the edge of the road because all the water runs off the road, and so there's more deep soil moisture on the edge of the road than there is farther in the field because it's getting all the water that's running off that edge of that road. So it's got more moisture on the side of the road. Typically, these roadsides are high sunlight areas, so there's a lot of grasses that grow along roadsides. So what is Caltrans most afraid of? Fire. So they mow the grasses. When did they mow the grasses? As soon as the grasses dry out. So the grasses tend to dry out in April and May. You're going to see a lot of crews out there mowing in about a month or two, especially in this dry year. Trying to get rid of their the dry fuels, because cars are the number one, cars and, of course, cigarettes and other things you throw out the window, are the main reason you get fire starting along the roadsides, and that impacts visibility and so forth. So it's one of the high priorities of Caltrans. So they mow those grasses as soon as they begin to turn brown. But at that stage, star thistle is oftentimes still a basal rosette. It's still a small growing plant. So star thistle says, oh my gosh, thank you. A little more light, that really helps. And it takes off. and it becomes what you see on this slide right here. Just a lot of star thistle along the roadside. But we thought, well, is there a way to use mowing if you use it at the right timing to control it? And so we started an experiment, and we looked at this. And there's two different types of mowers. There's flail mowers and there's rotary mowers, but we like to use the rotary mowers. Rotary mowers pull the blade like this. Flail mowers do this. You guys are all too young to remember when I was a kid, I had those push mowers, They were all flail-type mowers. But this is what we did. We looked at all different types of ways of trying to control star thistle using mowing. Looked at timing, looked at growth form, looked at a number of different things, heights of the mower, to try to get a feel for it. And what we found is that there are two different types of growth form you can find in star thistle, depending upon how competitive the environment is. If you have a highlight environment, then your plants are going to look like the one on the left. They're going to have a lot of basal leaves, and I'll show you data on that. If you have a very competitive environment, the plants are going to look like the ones on the right, where most of the leaves are in the middle of the plant, not at the base of the plant. Okay? So think about it this way. This is your soil surface. And if I come in with a typical 4-inch mowing height right in here, the plant on the left has lots of leaves still underneath the mower, and it has lots of buds, because at the base of the leaf are new buds. That plant just recovers. The plant on the right has no leaves to photosynthesize and produce more energy, and it probably doesn't have very many buds either, so it dies. So the growth form is very important. Now, the plant I show you on the far right here, the one that still has the flowers on it, that's a plant that looked like the one on the left, and it's actually a couple of plants. And I mowed that plant 3 times. And I mowed it at the perfect stage. The stage is the spiny stage. Before it produces viable seed, I mowed it 4 inches. And I let it get back to the spiny stage. I mowed it again. And I mowed it again. And I didn't kill it. I turned it into a little yellow star thistle pincushion. And I'll show you that. So if you look at this, standard mowing height, if you're in full sun, plant is exposed, it doesn't have a whole lot of competition, you can see the height of the branches is very low. In fact, it's below the mowing height. It's going to recover. It's going to do well. If you're in a shaded area, shaded by other plants, for example, grasses or a really dense star thistle area, the branching pattern, the height of the branching is way up there, almost at 25 centimeters, way above the height of the mowing. Those plants die. You can get 100% kill with those kinds of plants. So you kind of have to be careful of where you use mowing as a control strategy. The other thing about mowing is the plant in the foreground I mowed 3 times. It's doing just fine. Plant in the background is a control plant I didn't mow. Okay, do you notice another difference between those plants besides the height? One's green, one's brown. Remember I told you about moisture in the roots? Well, now you've cut that plant so many times, it's not losing its root moisture. So it's living a lot longer into the year. And if it happens to rain, if this plant can live, say, into October or November and it rains, that plant will be a perennial. I will perennialize that plant. Whereas the plant in the background, it used all the moisture in its root system. It went through its whole life cycle. It's done. It's not coming back. It's dead. So poor timing and if you don't understand the growth form of mowing can actually make a situation worse rather than better. So if you see the plants and they're really skinny and they don't have any basal leaves because those basal leaves can't get any sunlight, so they wither and die, that's where you can use mowing as an effective tool. Now, sometimes people will say, well, gosh, here's the problem. I need to control star thistle, but I can't wait until the very end of the season to determine whether I can use mowing. Because what if it turns out I can't use mowing? I lost my opportunity to use an early season control strategy, right? So I said, what would I do? And I said, this is what I'd do. Go out in the field in the middle of winter and look at the skeletons from last year and see what their growth form looks like. If the skeletons from last year look like a tumbleweed, you're probably not going to be able to use mowing. Go with an early season strategy. If they look like little sticks coming out of the ground, and you look at the 4-inch height, and there's nothing there but little sticks, straight little sticks coming out of the ground, mowing might be a good option for you. So you can utilize the information from earlier in the year with the dead material to get an estimate of what your property might look like and whether you can use mowing as a control strategy. Not just as simple as just going out and mowing them. Now, many of you probably think of biocontrol as being, the most common way that people control yellow star thistle. And there's a lot of energy been put into biocontrol. There's been 6 or 7 organisms released, and 1 more we're hoping to get released. But all of the insects at this point that have been released all do the same thing. They all feed on the seeds, or their larvae feed on the seeds. So they're all seed head feeders. The new one that they're trying to get released actually feeds on the roots, and that might be a better strategy. So of all the 6 or so organisms, insects that have been released, only 2 are even marginally effective, and that's these 2, the hairy weevil and the false peacock fly. The false peacock fly is an interesting story because they introduced the peacock fly, which is Catarrhalia australis. And they found that it didn't do well anywhere in California. It only did well in one area of Oregon, southern Oregon. And they said, well, why is it doing well, staying alive, attacking star thistle, but nowhere else? And they realized that this insect comes out very early in its life cycle, early in yellow star thistle's life cycle. It's a seed head feeder. It comes out before there's any seed heads in yellow star thistle. So it has nothing to eat. Rest of California just dies because there's nothing to eat. Why does it survive in Oregon? Because it attacks one other plant, bachelor's buttons, which is a centaurea. And bachelor's buttons comes out early. So it comes out of the ground when it pupates, and then it attacks bachelor's buttons. It produces another generation, and when that generation comes out, star thistle's ready. So they thought, well, this insect isn't really going to work because bachelor's buttons really doesn't occur in most of the area where star thistle is. All of a sudden, the insect started to move and started to be successful in all different regions of California. So the entomologists at CDFA said, wow, why is that happening? Nothing happened for years, and all of a sudden it's moving down. Let's look at this insect again. And it turned out it was a different species. It was this species, Catarrhalia succinia, so they called it the false peacock fly. And the false peacock fly comes out much later in the year than the peacock fly. So it's timed perfectly with yellow star thistle. The problem, however, is remember when you get a biocontrol agent released, you have to go through multitudes of studies to show it's not going to attack other thistles. Well, what are the important other thistles in California? Safflower, artichokes. So 2 crops. So they put a moratorium on the movement of this. They stopped moving it around, and they started doing all the host testing after the fact. Cows out of the barn, horse out of the barn. And now they're doing all the experiments. Turns out, fortunately, it did not attack any of those other crop species. That was good. Also turned out they never had to lift the moratorium because this insect is so mobile that by the time they finished those studies, it was everywhere they were going to move it to anyway. So they did this study with CDFA in which they looked at the populations of these 2 organisms. They looked at the hairy weevil, Eusthenopus villosus, and the false peacock fly. So the hairy weevil's on the left and the false peacock fly is on the right. And you can see the false peacock fly, the red is very dense, then yellow, then green. The black dots are where it really isn't very common. And you can see how much more common that false peacock fly is. And in fact, another thing you can see in this area is the one area where Eusthenopus is very, very common, right in here where most of the red and the yellow is the areas where Catarrhalia is not very common. So they competitively exclude each other. They don't work in synergy. They work against each other because they lay their eggs into a seed head, and what will happen is that the Catarrhalia larvae will kill the Eusthenopus larvae if they lay their eggs into the same seed head. So they eliminate the other one. So they don't work together. They work against each other. But primarily, Catarrhalia is the more widespread of the two biocontrol agents. Now, they attack a lot of the seed heads, both of them do, but as I mentioned to you earlier, you got to knock out at least 99% of seed production to have a significant impact, even 95%. And the best these have been able to do is 75%. That sounds great, but that's not enough. You need to knock out more. And this is why it's only in certain areas you see some effect of the biocontrol agents. In most of the state, you don't see any effect on biocontrol. So what this one also shows you is that the Eustenopus is a very early season insect. You can see right in here in early season, 72% attack rates in the early season, and only 9% attack rate late in the season. Catarrhelia, that's because they're called univoltine. They only produce one generation, Eustenopus. They lay their eggs. Those eggs, they come out, and that's it. That's the one generation. Whereas Catarrhelia has multiple generations, or multivoltine. Their larvae can then become adults, and they can produce more eggs, and their larvae then are around, so they can go 2 and 3 generations a year. And so as a result, you can see they have some impact later on in the season, whereas Eustenopus only has impact early in the season. In fact, we did some experiments saying, okay, how effective are these things? Let's say we kill all these buds. We just squish them, and we simulate the herbivory of these insects. And so we did this with USDA, and what we found that we compared it to mowing, and we said that mowing's pretty good. Mowing knocks out seed production. You can see in the middle on the bottom graph. And it knocks out the total development of seed heads, and it knocks out shoot weight, all the things you might expect from mowing. It makes a smaller plant, knocks out seed production. But then if you look at bud damage and what the biocontrol agents, in the long run, they didn't have any impact on seed production. So this is a little bit depressing because the best control strategy, if you could get it to work, is biocontrol. But 75% of biocontrol programs aren't successful. 25% have a reasonable amount of success. But even so, in Australia, they looked at the success rate of biocontrol, and they estimated the cost they put into it and the money they saved. It's a 17-to-1 ratio. For every dollar they put into a biocontrol program, they saved $17, even with all the failures, because the successes are so economically effective. Now, a few years ago, they released a different organism, a rust fungus. It's named Puccinia jacea, and variety solstitialis, because it's very specific on yellow star thistle. A friend of mine who is with the USDA in Beltsville, Maryland, worked on this thing for 15 years of his career. And so 15 years he dedicated to trying to get this agent released. And he finally succeeded, maybe about 7-8 years ago. He succeeded in getting it released. He had to do so many tests. The agent came from Turkey, which is where yellow star thistle can be found native. And so it was released, I guess it was 11 years ago now, by CDFA. Now, what it does is you can see, if you look at this slide, you can see that it forms these little pustules, these little typical symptoms of a rust. Let me see if I can. You can see them all over the black little pustules in here. And so the idea was that in the laboratory where he was working, what he found is that it really reduced the biomass of the plant, it reduced the root growth, and as I told you earlier, if you could reduce that root growth, other plants can compete with it, particularly the annual grasses. Wow, maybe you could have a competitive disadvantage of star thistle. You won't kill the plant, but it won't be as competitive, and other things can knock it out. So we set up this experiment testing this. This is in Davis. And this is my student, John O'Brien, who did this, who worked for Audubon, and Guy Kaiser, who works with me. And so we inoculated half this plant, and we set up another experiment. We looked at competition between wild oats, which is mainly in our rangelands, where star thistle is, and star thistle. And so we monitored this over the year, and all of these little plots right in here. So just to give you this is what it looks like at a field site, and I'm going to give you sort of a quick time lapse. So then later on, everything started to grow. We inoculated them all. Everything went really well. We could see all the rust showing up on the plots that we inoculated. It looked great. Plants looked healthy. But at the end of the season, everything looked the same. You couldn't tell any difference between the inoculated and non-inoculated. It was just all solid star thistle in each of the plots that we had. So it was a little depressing. There were some subtle differences. For example, the total rosette diameter was a little bit smaller in the inoculated ones. It was statistically significant. It was a little bit smaller. The black bar here is the ones that were inoculated. Biomass was a little bit smaller 1 year, but overall in 2 years, no difference. And total seed heads, well, there was a trend of a few less seed heads, but they weren't statistically significant. So clearly this isn't going to work. And why doesn't it work? It looks so good in the lab, and it didn't work in the field. And the reason it didn't work in the field is because the rust needs soil. It needs a lot of moisture in the air to do well, like a lot of rusts do. They have to have that soil, not the soil moisture, but the air moisture, and they'll do very well because they're on the leaves. So they looked really good in March when we put them out. But what happens in California in May, June, July, August? It gets really dry, and humidity goes way down, and the rust did nothing. And the plants just compensated and got back to their normal size. So it just isn't going to be a very effective, unfortunately, biocontrol program in California. Looked so good in the lab, but didn't look so good in the field. So that's another biocontrol. And then we looked at it in comparison to, with wild oats. Well, obviously, if it didn't do anything in growth, it's probably not going to do anything in competition. And these are called replacement series grafts. And the only point I want to make here is that the lines are the same whether they're inoculated or not on the top ones right in here. Star thistle inoculated or non-inoculated. And they didn't show any difference. You'd see a big divergence in those two lines if you saw, let's say, wild oat being more competitive against star thistle than when it was inoculated and non-inoculated. So it really didn't do anything, and that's really unfortunate because I just want biocontrol to take care of the problem. Simple way of doing it. It's the most economical way. So they're still looking at biocontrol, but haven't come up with a solution yet. Any questions on biocontrol before I go on? So let's get to some of the what I call cultural control strategies. Grazing and burning are cultural control because humans are manipulating them. I don't call grazing biocontrol because you're moving animals from site to site in various stalking rates and in various timings. So there's 3 animals, of course, that can be used for star thistle control if you're going to try to graze it. There's cattle and sheep and goats. Never horses. Star thistle's poisonous to horses, so you never want to use horses. So cattle, they tend to prefer grasses, but they will eat star thistle, but they prefer grasses. Sheep, they prefer broadleaves, so they like things like star thistle. And goats, well, they'll eat anything, pretty much. So star thistle is really, really high in protein when it's green. It's 14% protein. That's extremely high. But the animals won't eat it. At least most sheep and cattle won't eat it in the spiny stage. And in fact, once star thistle infestation reaches 30%, so it's 30% of the cover, animals avoid the area. And the reason is because when it's 30% cover in a uniform coverage, every single time a sheep or cattle put their head down, they put their head in a thorn, in a spine. So they begin to avoid. When it's lower than that, when it's 10%, they can find areas to eat in between the star thistle. But when it gets to about 30%, it's very difficult for them to ever put their head down and grab anything to eat without getting poked. So they move off-site. So you really, if you're going to graze, obviously with these animals you have to graze early. Now goats, they have the ability to work their way around the spine, so they'll even eat star thistle in the spiny stage. They prefer woody vegetation. Sheep and cows, they don't mind putting their head down. They don't worry so much about predators as goats do, so goats don't like putting their head down, so they like to be browsers and keep their heads high so they can see any kind of a predator coming. Now, the way you can do this, though, is oftentimes, and these animals will actually, they will go after yellow star thistle early on because of the high protein content of the plants. So they're not really a big problem. But when you have other plants, say like medusa head, where these animals don't want to eat medusa head, you have to put them in at very high stalking rates because they act like humans when they're in high stock. They act like humans all the time, actually. I mean, if you gave me a table full of food, all kinds of stuff, I'm going to avoid certain things like bell peppers. I just don't like bell peppers. I'm going to avoid them and pick what I like. Animals do the same thing. If you don't put them in with a high stocking rate, they pick and choose what they like the most, and they usually leave behind all the things that have high silica or have spines or the awns on them or whatever. But if you put me in a room and I was starving, and you put 100 of us at a table, and you said, this is all you're going to get to eat, I'm probably going to grab whatever I can and try to eat it as quick as I can, and animals will do the same thing. They're less selective. They just grab whatever they can. And so they'll eat noxious weeds a lot of times if you put them in a high enough density. So I don't do too much with grazing. Craig Thompson has done quite a bit with grazing of star thistle, but he has found that both sheep, goats, and cattle can effectively manage star thistle. They won't eliminate it, but they'll manage it. They do it very differently. Cows like to do it when it's bolting, because I don't know if you can see this right in here. Let me see if I can show you here. But that black cow has a tongue right in here that's sticking out. They stick their tongue out and they wrap it around the plant and pull it out, whereas sheep nibble. So they eat very differently. So sheep will nibble it down. Cows will yank it out when they eat this. That's why cows like grasses so much, because grasses grow in a way they can just grab them and pull them right out of the ground. So, but it can be fairly effective, but it doesn't tend to, it just suppresses the population when you use grazing. But a lot of people do like to use this early in the season. I like burning myself. It's more fun. And I always consider burning to be a real natural way of controlling some of these things. It's the way historical burns, in these areas in California, probably once every 9 years, and then when the Native Americans were here, they burned constantly, and they changed the burning regimes to once every 3 to 5 years. So selecting for certain things that they wanted to grow, and certainly burning will select for things that they like more, and it'll recycle nutrients and all that kind of stuff. So we were using burning, but when I started using burning, I looked at the literature, and the literature, there was only been a couple studies done on burning, and both of them showed that it didn't control yellow star thistle at all. But those studies were conducted for a single year. So I thought, well, maybe you have to use multiple years of burning because you've got to reduce that seed bank. Also, you have to have something else, something out there that can carry a fire, because the timing of which you're burning yellow star thistle, the plant's still green. Doesn't you no good to burn when the plant is already dried. It's already produced seed. It's fallen on the soil. Grassland fires never kill seed on the soil. They're not hot enough. So whenever a seed falls to the ground and you burn an area in a grassland, you're not going to kill the seed that's already on the ground. So you have to have the seed exposed directly. So we burned areas, and this is the East Bay Parks area, and they burned. So you have to have enough fuel to carry a fire. I mean, you oftentimes have to have grasses that dried out in there or something in there to carry a fire. You can see in this photo there are these green areas in here that just were so thick in star thistle that they didn't burn. They didn't have enough fuel to carry a fire in there. Most of the area did burn. They got about a 95% burn in this area, and they burned about 400 acres, and it was very effective. So the timing of burning, though, is right when star thistle begins to produce flowers. Very beginning. Now, star thistle is very different than grasses. Annual grasses, you can burn things like medusa head and ripgut brome and barb goat grass. You can burn those. Those grasses, as long as the seed is exposed to the direct flame, you'll kill them. But star thistle, you don't have the same luxury. The seed is protected in the seed head. If that seed is viable, a grassland fire will not kill that seed. It'll survive. So you have to burn before it produces viable seed. So we tend to burn at the end of June, right around the summer solstice, and that's when you've utilized a lot of your soil moisture, as I've told you before, because you don't want it to recover. So you got to after it uses the soil moisture, but before it produces viable seed, and that's the timing. So Like the literature, though, we found the same results. So you burn for 1 year, and guess what? You don't do anything. See this blue one right in here? That's a 1-year burn, and that's the cover of star thistle. We started out with 73% cover, and we went down to 71% cover. Not really very good control. But we kept doing it 2 and then 3 years, and after 3 years, we were down here at 90-something% control. And that's not too bad. Now, we have a native grass there, Nocella pulchra, which is the purple needlegrass. It's our state native grass. And after we burned the first year, we saw it decline. It wasn't statistical, but it declined. And, of course, the reason is because you take these big bunch grasses and you burn everything, and the next year they're still going to be alive, but they're smaller. So their cover isn't going to be as much. But when you burn multiple times, you create an environment that is really conducive to these perennial grasses, and their population increased by 13-fold by 3 years after burning. So that was really encouraging in this particular area. So this is purple needlegrass, which was quite nice, and we had high diversity in the burn sites here. We did all of this in Sugarloaf Ridge State Park, which is in Sonoma County, where they just couldn't do anything else. They had lots of star thistle and nothing else. They couldn't apply herbicides. They couldn't mow. They couldn't diff. They couldn't put grazing animals in there. The only option they had was burning, and so that's why we did that experiment there. Now, if you don't get anything else out of what I tell you about controlling star thistle, here is the main thing. If you cannot control the seed bank, you cannot control the plant. All your control programs are designed around getting rid of the seed bank. That's what you're trying to do. So, as an example, here is unburned areas we produce. This is per square meter, 10,000 seeds per square meter in 1995. A little less rainfall the next year, 7,000 seeds. A really drought year the year after that, a little less than 4,000 seeds per square meter. And then the really wet year in 98, about 13,000 seeds per square meter. Okay, that's in the unburned area. Now compare this one, 95, with this one. This was burned 1 year. We knocked it out, seed bank, by 75%. 75%, we reduced that seed bank. But I showed you the previous slide, no effect on biomass. Same amount of cover of yellow star thistle, even though you knocked out 75% of the seeds. You burn the next year, second year, and you knock it out much lower. You burn 3 years in a row, you knock it out by over 99%. Get rid of 99% of the seed bank. Now you're doing something. I did this on purpose, and I would normally never do this if it were my own land, but I did this on purpose in our research plot. I let it go. I burned 3 years in a row. I had very good control, and I let it go. And I monitored it. We monitored it 3 more years. The next year you come back, let's see if I can show you here, and you notice that seed bank starts to recover. The year after that was the drought year. It dropped a little bit. The year after that was the El Nino year. You're pretty much back to normal. So it looked great. 3 years, great. You didn't do anything 3 years after that? Back to normal. You've got to have a monitoring follow-up program. Can't stop. Got to have that follow-up program if you're going to control it. Otherwise, you just can do this, and you won't get long-term control. It's a busy slide. It's called indicator species analysis, and I'm just going to direct your attention to a very limited thing in here, because I want to show you why I think that Nocella pulchra is a really good choice for competing with yellow star thistle. So an indicator species analysis, you see the diagonal line. Anything on the top of the diagonal line means that burning is good for that species. That species likes to be burned. Anything below that diagonal says burning hurts that species. That species does not do well with a burn, the time that we burn. So we burned 3 years in a row, and we followed it 4 years later after that. So none of the burnings occurred while we were doing this. Now what I want to show you is this, okay? So these two species, the green triangle on the top, that's Nocella pulchra. That's the native perennial grass. And the square red box in the bottom is Centaurea solstitialis. That's yellow star thistle. So you can see after 3 years of burn, wow, Nocella looked great. Star thistle was really controlled, almost eliminated. Of course, there's still some seeds there. So that was a year after the burn. Come back a year later. Nocella still way up there. Star thistle starting to recover a little bit, but still not back to normal. If it runs right along the line, the diagonal line, it means burning has no effect on it. Next year, come back, Nocella's still up there. Star thistle can't get up there anymore. It's sort of restricted. Come back even 4 years later, the Nucella's still up there. Star thistle can't. So it looks to me like Nucella, remember I showed you perennial grasses earlier, use deep soil moisture too. Nucella competes with star thistle in these environments. If you can increase your Nucella through a burning program, it is not going to eliminate star thistle, but it's going to keep the population down because it's a direct competitor with star thistle for moisture. It's what we call a functionally similar plant. It's not taxonomically similar at all, but it's functionally similar. It functions the same way. Okay? So I'm going to get back to that when I talk about restoration a little bit, because you can see other species that do the same thing. These are the species we want to use in some of our restoration programs. So herbicide control. Well, you can apply herbicides depending on where you are by, hand equipment or by ATVs or even aerial application. This was done at Fort Hunter Liggett where they had so much yellow star thistle in this particular area. And so we've looked at a number of different compounds, and the two that we tend to focus on for star thistle control are milestone and transline. And if you've ever used an herbicide for star thistle control, those are probably the two you've heard of most. Transline is chlorpyrrolin and milestone is aminopyrrolate. So we look at these are incredibly effective herbicides on star thistle at very low use rates. So we're talking about ounces per acre. Like taking a stick of butter and being able to control 3 acres of star thistle 100% with a stick, something the size of a stick of butter. And that's the product material. That's not even the active ingredient, which is 1/4 of that. So we did that, and we found in this experiment that it's much better to apply when they're in the rosette stage than they're in their bolting stage. I mean, it looks like it's pretty good control even in the bolting stage, but 90% control isn't good enough. You're going to get a lot of seed production with 90% control. So we like to have better control, and 100% is even better. And so the rosette stage can give that for you. Now, the lowest use rate for milestone is right here. See that one, that 3 ounces? That's the lowest use rate. So you notice that you get pretty good control even with lower than the lowest use rate. And typically chemical companies do this because they realize you're not always going to apply the herbicide at that rate, that you're on every area. You're going to get hills and bumps and valleys, and you may get areas where you don't get as much herbicide. So they try to give you a little bit of buffer. But even 3 ounces, that's only 3/4 of 1 ounce of active ingredient per acre. So we got very, very good control. In other states, they used to use picloram, which we don't have registered in California. Now they no longer use picloram because you can see this one was 16 ounces an acre. And you can get 3 ounces an acre, the same kind of control. And transline gave a little better late season control than milestone. So this was like, if you could see that, this was like the first experiment we did with transline in Yolo County up along the foothills, where they sprayed aerially at actually less than the lowest rate. And on the right was the treated area, and the left was untreated area. And you can see it's just a line in the field. Very low drift potential, and they just had a line in the field. On the right, they didn't have a single star thistle plant in there. The ranchers were really amazed when they saw that particular photo. It's all grasses in there. So we looked at, anybody have questions? So we looked at a little more on the timing of using transline and using milestone. So milestone is up at the top here, and then transline's the one white bar right in here. And what we found is that November is a little too early to apply. It doesn't give you long enough soil residual activity to give you the full control. December, January, February, December, January, February, ideal time to apply if you're going to use these herbicides. At all rates, even the rate here, which is 2/3 of their lowest recommended rate, we still got, you can see, 100% control of star thistle using this. So December, January, and February are the ideal times to use these products. You could still get control in March, but you tend to have to go with a little higher rate to get really good control. So that's what the plants typically look like when you treat them. They're in this stage, the rosette stage. That's what a plant's going to look like, say, in January and February. So this is timing in which you want to apply when your plants look like this. The herbicides, both of those herbicides, Transline and Milestone, are really slow acting. Milestone did get a low-risk evaluation by EPA, which helped it get its registration early. But you get a very slow kill. It takes a month to kill the plants. So it takes quite a while to do it, so you don't worry. A lot of ranchers are like, oh, this stuff's not working, this stuff's not working. We always say, be patient, it'll work. And it does. So this would be Milestone at the lowest recommended rate, aminopyrrolid Milestone. It's on the left and the untreated on the right. 100% control. So it's extremely effective. It has certain other plants it does kill. It does attack or kill things in the legume family, Fabaceae, peas and beans, and a lot of composites. So those are the main things. And I'm going to show you that data a little later. So remember I told you about the water use of the roots go down. They only use water at a certain period of time. They've already used the water after basically July, so they're not going to use any more water. So when you go in and you treat plants before they even start to suck up that water, which I told you is the beginning of May in the rosette stage, on the left-hand side, this is the amount of good forage that you want. And you'll notice that this one right here is untreated, that you double the amount of forage when you control early. When you go in the bolting stage, where it's already used a lot of its water, you don't get any real big advantage to your forage. So if you're looking to increase your forage capacity in a particular area, you've got to treat early. And now you know why, because it hasn't used the water yet. And so the water's available for other species to use, and they do much better. So here's another newer herbicide that just got registered 2 months ago in California. It comes out as an herbicide called Perspective, and it's really a combination of two herbicides. I wish it just came out as a aminocyclopyrachlor, because by itself it does a lot of things I want it to do in controlling noxious weeds, but it's mixed with chlorsulfuron, and that limits where you could be able to use it, because it becomes now too hard on the grasses, and we want the grasses out there oftentimes. So, but it's also extremely effective. In fact, 100% control you can see of yellow star thistle at very low use rates too. So that's a new one. It's called Perspective. If you have other mustard problems, then this one might be an option. Mustard and yellow star thistle problems, but in many cases you probably won't be able to use it because the chlorsulfuron that's in that mix is going to damage too many desirable plants. So another busy slide, but I'll explain this to you. So what we want to know and what we get asked a lot is, okay, you can put an herbicide like aminopyrrolid down. What's it going to do to the native vegetation and diversity? If it kills, because you're setting objectives in your areas, and oftentimes your areas are to protect endangered species. But you might also set an objective, if you didn't have endangered species, you might set an objective as I want high native plant diversity. And it really doesn't do you much good to go in and kill a noxious weed and kill all your diversity too. That's really not what your objective is. As I tell people, if you really want to do that, a strip mall will do the same thing. So you're looking to have very selective control. You want to knock out this one weed species and let everything else that you want to survive. This is the real challenge in our world, because if you're in an ag world, your goal is you want everything to die but one, your crop. But when you're in our world, you usually want everything to live but one. A lot harder to do that than it is to kill everything but one. So, because you can manipulate your growing season to do that. So what we did is we went to an area rich in native plants. This was the McLaughlin Range, which is between Lake County and Napa County. And it's a reserve there. And we used two rates of Milestone. The high rate on the label, which is 7 ounces, and the low rate on the label, which is 3 ounces. And we monitored, and then we had uncontrolled plots. And these were fairly big plots, 100 feet by 100 feet. And we monitored all the vegetation within those plots. At the time before we treated, at the year we treated, and then 2 years after that. So we wanted to see what happened to all the native vegetation in there, what it hurt, what it didn't hurt. and whether things would recover in time. And so the year after we treated, and we did this twice, so the two top panels are both the year after the treatment. You can see, if you can read that, it says the Asteraceae, the Fabaceae, and in this case the Asteraceae is here. And then the Ranunculaceae was knocked out here, but I think it's an artifact because it didn't show in the first year when we had more. We just didn't have very many of them. And then I call this group the super roses, which is a couple of things related to roses. But anyway, you can see the untreated, and this is a probability deal. So you see, but look at the three corners. If something is in this corner right in here where it says untreated, that means the probability of finding that plant in the untreated is way higher than finding it in either other corner. All these things in the middle had no effect. They were not statistical, all those little symbols in the middle. So it tells you what we already know. The Asteraceae and the Fabaceae are very sensitive to milestone. We come back a second year. We come back now the year after. We haven't treated for another year. We come back, and so it's 2 years after the treatment. And we see that the Asteraceae is still significant. The larger the circle, the more significant. And the Apiaceae, which is the umbel family, carrot family, they're still inhibited. The Fabaceae, not as small, not as big a circle here. It's moving in. And in this one, you see sort of the same result here. The Fabaceae moving in. The Asteraceae barely shows any significance. And then you come back 3 years after the treatment, and some of them, like the Asteraceae, show higher levels in the treated area, but most of the things are lost, except for the Ranunculaceae. But Ranunculaceae is only 2%, so I don't know if that's real or not. But everything else is dissipated. So if you just look at biodiversity in general, you see that, sure enough, after that first year of treatment, here's the two treatments. There's the solid circle is the high rates. It definitely knocked back biodiversity and species richness in both trials. By the year after that, they're starting to catch up, and by the third year, there's no statistical difference anymore. So I would tell people if they wanted to use this that yes, you should expect damage in some of your desirable plants in the year after, but in time, they will come back. Now, a lot of people come to me and they say, how do I control star thistle? And, they're in June asking me this. And I say, well, you're way too late for all these early season treatments. You only have a couple of options. Can you burn? Can you mow? Can you graze? And then there's late season herbicide treatments. So sometimes they're going to say, yeah, I can burn. All right, you got a good option. See what's out there, though. Make sure you're not going to damage things that burning will cause problems with. Or mowing, or for all the different treatments. But sometimes they say, nope, the only option I have is an herbicide. So we tested that, and we found out that Roundup is really the only choice. Problem with Roundup, of course, as you know, it says it's very non-selective, so it gets everything. So to be non-selective, maybe use a wick applicator. A wick applicator, I don't like this particular wick applicator, but there's better ones. You just touch the plants you want to kill. And you can walk through a field very quickly, leaving everything you want, touching all the things, all the star thistle, and you can kill them. I wouldn't do this with a field that had 1 million plants in it, but it's a good follow-up program. Okay? And these are different types of wick applicators. So, for example, there was a rare and endangered species, and I can't even remember the name of it anymore. It was in the sunflower family, and it was down in Merced County, and they had a lot of star thistle, and they said, how do we treat star thistle and not control this endangered species? So I didn't know anything about the endangered species, so I looked it up, and it's a little composite, only grows about this size right in here, so they're worried about it. And I said, well, why don't you wait until the star thistle gets to around the spiny stage and then use one of these wick applicators that you see here. Set the height so it's above the endangered species, put glyphosate in it, Roundup, and go through the field and just touch all the star thistle plants. You won't touch any of the low-growing plants. And so you can be very selective with a non-selective herbicide. And so that's something you can do, handheld or using this kind of a system right in here. Now, we've tried organic compounds, too. But all organic herbicides to this point are contact products. They just burn the membranes and kill plants. So the most common one is acetic acid, which is vinegar. And it kills a lot of little seedlings of a lot of little plants, but it does not kill star thistle. It barely burns the leaves when you go at really, really high rates. Too high a rates that I would ever recommend for anybody because it'll melt your equipment and give you a headache. So it's probably not the option you want to go. But it still doesn't kill the yellow star thistle. So we were looking for all kinds of options, including organic options as well. So the last section I want to talk about before we open up to questions is, and finish up here, is the integrated approaches which we like to use. So we try to look at some of these things I've already discussed with you and say, well, how do we combine some of these to work really, really well? Burning and herbicides, maybe we can do that. So we go into an area where we have star thistle, and one area was in San Benito County and one area was in Yuba County. And they had different levels of star thistle. In San Benito County, you can see on that one, they had high levels. The uncontrolled plots had about 80% star thistle cover. In the other area, they only had about 12-13% star thistle cover. And so we said, let's use an integrated approach. Let's combine, burning 2 years in a row. Then we'll use burning in the first year, transline the second year. We'll use transline the first year, burning the second year, and then 2 years of transline. And we'll compare and see which ones give us the long-term best control. So it's an integrated approach, combining all kinds of things. My thought process, and I was wrong about this one too, is I thought the perfect option would be to use transline the first year, but that would kill the legumes, but it would also kill star thistle, and then burn the second year, because burning stimulates legumes and kills star thistle. So I can get 2 years of control of star thistle, and I can get my legumes all to recover the second year. Now, I want to show you what happened, though. When I used that combination, transline followed by burning, it did not work. And in Yuba, it gave me more star thistle than I had in the untreated plots. So that combination did not work, and I'll tell you why in a minute. When I burned 2 years in a row in Yuba, it worked fantastic. When I burned 2 years in a row in San Benito, it didn't work well. Why? Because there was so much star thistle that I was able to carry a fire the first year with all the dead material on the ground, couldn't carry a fire the second year. So the star thistle did well. So what did work in both of these areas? Well, 2 years of transline worked fine, but burning followed by chlorpyrrolid. Finally realized that burning stimulates the germination of yellow star thistle. So if you can stimulate the germination and then kill it the next year with the herbicide, you can get way ahead of the game. Now, let's take Yuba County, because this is why it's important to understand what you have out there. In Yuba County, we had star thistle, 13% star thistle. But we also had ripgut brome, and we had Medusa head. And so now here's the same experiment, looking at this, looking at Medusa head. Now, remember I told you the two best things in that area were 2 years of burning worked great, burning followed by chlorpyrrolid worked great, and chlorpyrrolid 2 years in a row worked great for star thistle. But you're just selecting for Medusa head and ripgut brome by using the herbicide 2 years in a row. That's why you need to integrate your approaches. So in this area, if you could burn 2 years in a row, you could get all three species. If you can't burn 2 years in a row, you can burn 1 year followed by chlorpyrrolid the second year. You could still get pretty good control of these species, these grasses, and excellent control of yellow star thistle. So you have to know what species you have out there before you integrate these various approaches. And we took this on a big scale, over to 400 ligand, and we used it on 200-acre burns and bigger burns. And what we found is the same kind of thing. 2 years of a burning first year, followed by transline the second year, and we knocked out, here's the percent, we knocked out seed production by looking at seedling counts by 99.6%, and we did it in two different sites exactly the same. We followed this last one here, though, with a burn, and it started to jump back. So you never want to end with a burn, unless you do multiple burns. You want to start with a burn. And why is that so effective? It's because burning, if you burn, you knock out, you get more seed germinating, and if you kill those seed right in here following a burn, you actually can deplete that seed bank way faster by burning as long as you kill all those seedlings the next year. So burning is a great tool for stimulating the seed bank and getting rid of it. Remember I told you, got to get rid of the seed bank. That's critical. Now there's other things that people have been working with. They're really not available right now, but they're combinations. This is more for roadsides. They're combinations of mowing and herbicides put together on the same platform, so you can actually get rid of, solve the problem of fire potential, but at the same time get rid of the star thistle, so you don't have to deal with that. And I don't know where these are going. There's been 2 pieces of equipment that have been developed, and neither one has become commercially available, so I'm not sure where they are. We've done some reseeding, with perennials, and we like that, and I showed you that before, and this is an area in Siskiyou. In the foreground is just herbicide, and what filled in? Downy brome, cheatgrass. In the background, we did a reseeding with a wheatgrass, and it became a very excellent area without any yellow star thistle. So just to show you this, if you just treat 1 year in the blue, see the bar here, it says chlorpyrrolid 97 right in here. Treat this 1 year with chlorpyrrolid. Next year you had just as much star thistle because your seed bank was there. Treated it 2 years, you knocked it out by a few percent. You had to treat 3 years in a row with the herbicide. But if you reseeded, reseeding alone gave you 50% control. With 1 year of chlorpyrrolid, you're down to about 85% control. With 2 years, you don't need 3 years. So you can shorten your control and reduce the amount of herbicides you have to use by using an integrated approach in this particular area. But this area gets 3.5 inches of summer rainfall, so it's important for them to get it. That was important to get it established. So just to show you, the more perennial grass you have, the less star thistle you have. So perennial grasses can be very important tools for control of star thistle. I think I'm going to skip this one because it says the same thing on that one, and I'm going to skip that one too. So I'm just going to summarize right here. There's lots of successful ways of controlling star thistle. We've looked at, timely mowing, grazing, burning, herbicides. I'm not including biocontrol in this because I don't think it's as effective. But the keys to successful control is to deplete your seed bank. Otherwise, you're fighting it forever. And how do you deplete your seed bank? Well, you prevent off-site recruitment. You don't bring it in with vehicles. You don't bring it in with hay contamination. You don't bring it in with livestock. It doesn't really move much by wind. And you prevent on-site recruitment. You don't settle for 90% control. You don't leave skips. You don't leave fringe areas with star thistle or along fence lines or satellite populations. You've got to get rid of the seed bank. You've got to think in that terms. The other thing is you've got to monitor and detect where your star thistle is so it doesn't build up its seed banks. And as I showed you, when my seed banks built up when I didn't do anything, you have to have a follow-up program to keep those plants from continually reproducing and recruiting more seed. So that's kind of the key to the control of yellow star thistle. Okay, I think I'll stop there. 2:45, leave you 15 minutes if that's okay. If anybody has any questions, be happy to answer. Oh, great.
So I'll read these for you. Will hoeing before flower in limited areas, of course, work by detaching root from plant?
Yes. Hoeing before flowering is a very good way. You just got to be careful because you're causing a disturbance there.
Okay, that's a good answer. Next one. If it's a lot colder here in winter in southern Oregon at about 4,500 feet, would life stages of yellow star thistle be slower or farther behind than in central California?
Yes, farther behind. It pushes it back. It can push it back anywhere from a month to a month and a half back. So everything I told you about May would apply to June to then later. Yes.
And then as a follow-up for that one, how can we apply herbicide in months of January through March when herbicide is best used while there's still snow on the ground?
Yeah. So the snow areas, then you would apply right after snow melt. The plants are still going to be very small, and it's going to be light because you're really more interested in the growth stage of the plant rather than the calendar. So if you have a rosette, if it's a rosette in April, it's going to be just as effective as the rosette here in January.
Do you know how long the seed lives in the seed bank?
Yes, the seed. The first study that talked about this said the seeds live 10 years, but all those studies were done in a lab. It doesn't live 10 years. Most of the seed, 99% of the seed will live 3 years. But is if you ever look at one of these decay curves, there's always a little bit that'll live 10 years. Yeah. So, but the 99% of the seed will only live 3 years, and if you add a burning in there, 2 years. Okay.
What proportion of the seeds will germinate within the first year versus the second or third years?
75% in the first year. 75% will germinate the first year, and you'll usually get 75% or more after that. So you can say 75%, then 75% of 25 is, so you can see how you can reduce it pretty quickly. But yeah, about 75% of the seed. Now, about 75% of the total seed that germinate, but 30 to 40% of the seed that's dispersed will be decayed, eaten by birds, decayed by pathogens. So of the seed that do germinate, 75% will germinate, but a good proportion of them are also decayed by pathogens or eaten by birds.
Are there any other questions? Looks like nope. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys for your attention.